This video was sponsored by Brilliant. What if I told you that the US government might not have a spotless track record when it comes to drugs? I know, bold claim. But the truth is that some of the drugs that are classified as the most dangerous with no medical benefit to humanity may be anything but. So listen up, because the future of mental health care might just involve some of these illegal substances. If you grew up in early America, things were pretty different when it came to drugs. This was the age when if you had a cough, you could walk to your nearby pharmacy and just pick up a bottle of Bayer heroin. Or if your baby was being fussy, well, then simply give them some of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup and it'll put your child right to sleep. Never mind the fact that it was essentially just morphine and alcohol. As you can imagine, this led to a lot of awful side effects and deep addictions and mysterious deaths. Most people didn't even know what was going on. They had no idea what they were actually putting into their bodies. For over 100 years, the United States had no laws controlling drugs. The first drug control law was the Pure Food and Drug Act, which passed in 1906. And it didn't actually restrict any drugs from being sold, but it required that the people selling this stuff put a label on the product that told folks what the heck was in it. As you can imagine, a lot of people were pretty pissed when they found out what was in their favorite wonder cures. Like, oh, I didn't realize there was cocaine in this. It wasn't until the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914 that we saw true control placed on certain kinds of drugs, specifically narcotics. This act limited narcotic prescriptions and outlawed the use of opium, morphine, heroin, and cocaine for non-medical uses. And then over the next 50 years or so, the US went on to pass more than 200 laws regarding the distribution, use, and advertisement of drugs, including prohibition in 1919, which was quickly reversed in 1933 because we said, yeah, give me that yummy yellow grain water. Or in the 1940s or 50s, Harry Anslinger pushed super racist and strict laws around the possession of certain kinds of drugs. And in 1961, an international treaty was signed to set limits on substances like cannabis and newer synthetic drugs like methadone and fentanyl. But the big overhaul in American drug policy came in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act. This act was the Mac Daddy of all drug laws, meant to combine all existing federal drug policies into one, as well as add many new restrictions. Perhaps the two best known results of this act include the formation and establishment of the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, which is the federal law enforcement agency that combats drug trafficking and distribution, and the creation of drug scheduling, which is the system used to sort controlled substances into different categories from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5. Now, this is really what I want to talk about because, as I'll explain very soon, there's a debate about how some of these drugs are classified, particularly Schedule 1 drugs. Schedules essentially act as a scale for how dangerous a drug is based on certain criteria that roughly classify the drug's potential for abuse, addiction, or other dangerous outcomes, as well as whether it has a medical use. So when new drugs are brought onto the scene, the DEA evaluates the drug based on those criteria and then decides where it lands on that scale. Schedule 5 substances are the least controlled, and Schedule 1 substances are the most controlled. Now, I know that I'm saying controlled a lot, but in this context, it literally means the degree to which the government maintains control over distribution and use of these substances. The idea behind this scheduling system is to put restrictions on substances for the good of the public, so that these drugs only get into the hands of qualified individuals. At least that's the hope. As a side note, while many drugs are controlled, not all drugs are scheduled. For example, Prozac is controlled in that you need a prescription for it, but it's an unscheduled drug because the risk of abusing it is pretty tiny, so the DEA doesn't really care about that. In any case, Schedule 1 controlled substances are different from the rest. While Schedules 2 through 5 are all seen as having some medical application, but just with varying degrees of potential for abuse, Schedule 1 drugs are those that the US DEA have classified as having no medical uses and a high potential for abuse and addiction. They include drugs like heroin, Quaaludes, GHB, that is unless it's an FDA-approved formula patented under the name Zyme, cat or cathinone, PCP, bath salts. The list goes on and on. I could just keep listing them out and you probably wouldn't even know most of them. Now you might hear that list and say, yeah, I think I'm on board with this. All of those drugs sound pretty scary. And true, all of these drugs are highly illegal and they could get you into a lot of trouble if you're caught using them recreationally. They can also be dangerous if they're used unwisely. However, among the long list of Schedule 1 controlled substances, there's at least a handful that show amazing promise for treating serious mental illnesses when used in conjunction with therapy. Which ones? Well, let's go in alphabetical order. The letter A is for ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a tea brewed from particular plants that contain DMT, which is a psychedelic compound, and also MAOIs, which prevent the DMT from breaking down too quickly. Ayahuasca has long been used in indigenous communities for healing ceremonies in the Amazon rainforest, and chemists have also developed synthetic DMT. Both ayahuasca and DMT have strong psychoactive effects, producing intense and sometimes scary highs. Users report feeling like they're traveling at warp speed through bright lights, having out-of-body experiences, or finding themselves transported to a new world where they communicate with elf-like beings. The biggest known risk of large or frequent doses of this drug is serotonin syndrome, where your brain dumps out just a bunch of serotonin and overactivates the nervous system, which in turn can be fatal. That said, we don't know if DMT is addictive, and it doesn't seem like it induces tolerance, so that's kind of interesting. Some research shows ayahuasca being useful for the treatment of depression. The first controlled trial to test ayahuasca in treatment-resistant depression happened in 2018, and it showed that after a single dose of ayahuasca, participants experienced almost immediate antidepressant effects compared to those who received a placebo. And another more recent study from 2020 followed 40 subjects over 6 months after taking ayahuasca for the first time and found that almost 80% of subjects showed clinical improvement in their depression. Additionally, the study took a look at long-term ayahuasca users and found that they scored higher on quality of life and lower in depression, even compared to the one-time ayahuasca users. There's several other very small studies that show similar results, so it seems like there's some serious potential, but it just needs more research. Now, luckily, the UK just approved the world's first clinical trial studying the efficacy and safety of DMT-assisted therapy for the treatment of depression, so we'll see where that goes. Beyond this, there's also some preliminary evidence that ayahuasca may be effective for treating drug abuse and addictive behaviors, particularly for alcohol, tobacco, and cocaine use. Though, I gotta say, much of the evidence so far relies on self-reports and has really small sample sizes, so more research is needed. L is for LSD. Also known as acid, LSD is a psychedelic drug that's synthesized from lysergic acid, which comes from a fungus that grows on rye and some other grains. It's got a wide range of effects, but the hallmark of the LSD experience is a distortion in how you see people around you or the things around you, visual distortions, hallucinations, or changes to thought processes. Now, luckily, LSD is not considered addictive, though you can develop a pretty quick tolerance to it if you take it too often. Some of the less pleasant side effects include having bad trips, which can make it hard to adjust back to reality. And some folks report having flashbacks where they experience hallucinations for weeks or even years afterwards. But overall, the drug doesn't appear to be particularly dangerous. You're not gonna overdose and kill yourself by taking too much of this. Believe it or not, Research on using LSD for treating mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and addiction started all the way back in the 1950s. But that all changed in 1970 when the Fire Nation attacked. With the Controlled Substances Act. It took decades for research into LSD's potential as a psychiatric treatment to start up again. But luckily, unlike DMT, LSD has had a lot more research under its belt by now. A 2020 review of 11 randomized controlled clinical trials showed that LSD has significant potential as a treatment for alcoholism. In fact, research indicates that a single dose of LSD is as effective as taking naltrexone, Camperol, or Antabuse daily, which is incredible. Other studies have shown promising results regarding LSD-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety, particularly anxiety experienced in relation to a life-threatening disease like cancer. After only 2 LSD experiences as part of a 3-month treatment plan, participants reported decreased anxiety and increased quality of life even a year after receiving treatment. Now, the evidence is mounting, and I honestly could see LSD becoming an accepted medical treatment in the next 15 years, but I guess you can quote me on that. M is for MDMA. MDMA, or perhaps better known as Molly or ecstasy, is a party drug that was originally developed in 1912 by the pharmaceutical company Merck, although they didn't develop it as a party drug. This substance is often called the love drug because it gives users an increased sense of well-being, enhanced sensory perception, more energy and alertness, a heightened sense of empathy and emotional warmth towards others, and you can see why this would be such a popular drug at raves. That said, some users report uncomfortable experiences such as panic attacks and confusion, and high doses can lead to serotonin syndrome, or it can even impact the body's ability to thermoregulate, which can cause dangerous overheating and dehydration. Also, after the effects of MDMA wear off, a lot of users report feeling down or blue or under the weather for a few days. Now, tolerance of MDMA does form pretty quickly, but luckily, it doesn't appear to be very addictive. So here's something that I learned while researching this topic. Apparently, MDMA was being used in therapy for a while. That is, until it got banned. Yeah, apparently therapists started using it in the 1960s, and it became fairly popular until 1985 when the DEA administrator defined it as a Schedule I drug. That is, despite the DEA judge determining that it should be Schedule III. Anyway, I digress. I know I made the bold prediction that LSD would be approved for medical use in the next 15 years, but honestly, the first drug on this list that will receive that approval will almost certainly be MDMA. In 2017, the FDA designated MDMA a breakthrough therapy for PTSD after evaluating the results of 6 phase 2 studies that indicate significant results. And just recently, in May 2021, a phase 3 randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study with 90 participants was published in Nature, showing that 2 months after treatment, 67% of participants in the MDMA group no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. A second phase 3 trial is currently underway, and as long as everything goes according to plan, federal approval of MDMA as a drug, as a medicine, could come as early as 2023. And that would be huge because it would open the doors for MDMA research for other medical uses, some of which are currently being studied, including social anxiety in autistic adults and eating disorders. P is for psilocybin. Psilocybin is a psychedelic compound found in hundreds of species of fungi. As you can imagine, this is why people refer to them as magic mushrooms, or just shrooms for short. The effects of mushrooms are fairly similar to those of LSD, so in an attempt to not repeat myself, I'll just say that mushrooms tend to produce a more whole body experience, while LSD is more cerebral. Additionally, it's generally accepted that mushrooms provide a less intense, shorter high that's better tolerated compared to LSD. The potential side effects are more or less the same, but again, less intense compared to LSD. And also, like LSD, shrooms aren't addictive, though tolerance does develop quickly if you use it frequently. There's overlap with potential therapeutic uses too. Psilocybin research has indicated significant results for treating addictive behaviors, particularly with alcohol and tobacco addictions. Likewise, a 2016 paper showed that psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy significantly relieved existential anxiety and depression in people with life-threatening cancer diagnoses. But distinctly, in 2018, the FDA designated psilocybin a breakthrough therapy for treating depression. So that means accelerated research and approval process for the drug. Now, there's still a decent amount of research that needs to be done, and it's going to take years to get to the point that we're at with MDMA, but I'm willing to bet that it'll be federally approved for medical use within the same timeline that I gave for LSD, so about 15 years. And actually, psilocybin became legal for mental health treatment in supervised settings in Oregon in February 2021. Now, it's only legal in Oregon, it's not legal anywhere else, but it's clear that there's something of a shift among public perception. So who knows? Maybe mushrooms will be like our last drug. C is for cannabis. Yeah, I know, technically this one should have been the second on the list, but it seems like the strangest one on our list. Cannabis, or weed, or marijuana, or whatever you want to call it, is still a Schedule I drug. Now, there's a whole lot of history as to how and why cannabis became so intensely controlled, and for that, I'll point you to our video about the neuroscience of cannabis, which you can find also in the description. Anyway, the active ingredient in cannabis tends to be THC, which when consumed can lead to feelings of euphoria, relaxation, altered perceptions, etc., etc. And the side effects can include paranoia, increased anxiety, poor memory recall, difficulty concentrating, and mild hallucinations. Cannabis is not physically addictive, but tolerance does develop with frequent use. So, what medical uses does weed have? Well, of course, it's been indicated as a treatment for an assortment of physical illnesses, including chronic pain, inflammatory diseases, and sleep disorders. But in terms of mental health treatment, there's not a lot of great evidence. I mean, there's claims that cannabis could be helpful for anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder, but the results seem mixed at best. And the studies are few and far between. I mean, to be honest, the most convincing research surrounds the use of CBD, or cannabidiol. One study indicated that CBD may be useful for social anxiety disorder by reducing anxiety in the moment. And another study indicates that it may decrease nightmares or rumination tendencies in people suffering from PTSD. However, it should be noted that all this is pretty preliminary, and I was pretty surprised that there's not more research into cannabis in general. And that's perhaps the perfect segue to the bigger issue. See, when you look at clinical research about these drugs, the studies are all extremely small. I mean, even the phase 3 trials only have 100 participants, and a majority of the research doesn't even happen in the United States, despite receiving their funding here. Now, this, of course, is due to the amount of control that's been placed on these substances. Classifying a drug as Schedule I technically allows it to be used for research purposes, but its legal production is so limited and its distribution is so tightly controlled that it effectively acts as a barrier or a deterrent to conducting those experiments. On top of that, researchers have to have their studies approved by Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Drug Enforcement Administration in order to legally obtain supplies, which costs a lot of time and money. So this results in a catch-22 where there's not enough scientific evidence to change a drug's Schedule I status because its Schedule I status limits its ability to be researched. And we just saw this happen with cannabis in 2016, where the DEA reaffirmed its decision to keep marijuana as a Schedule I drug, ranking higher than other drugs like cocaine or meth, because there wasn't enough research to support its medical use. So that's the issue that we're facing. Our outdated scheduling system has bewilderingly lumped drugs together and classified them as the most dangerous because they don't yet have the evidence to be used medically. But this is a real crisis. I mean, the cost of mental illnesses to American society is around $200 billion annually, which is more than any other medical condition. The brain is such a hard organ to treat. As we grow up, our brains organize themselves and create constraints. But in the process, sometimes we develop maladaptive neurological pathways that result in serious mental health diagnoses. Now, it seems like many of these substances have the ability to activate new pathways that allow for new ways of thinking, and it may have a rapid effect on these disorders. If powerful potential medications are being held under lock and key, well, that seems practically unethical, right? The World Health Organization, United Nations, US government, and many other institutions around the world have told us that these drugs are too risky to be studied. However, studying these drugs in controlled clinical research settings is our best opportunity to truly understand the real risks and rewards that they can offer. It's time to loosen the grip on this kind of research. It's that kind of scientific thinking that'll push us forward in medicine. And I think that regardless of your career or interests, it's so important to learn how to approach topics from an unbiased, inquisitive perspective. And as we can see with our current drug scheduling, it's easy to create nonsensical answers to questions when you're unduly influenced by fear or bigotry or politics. So if you're looking for ways to improve your critical reasoning and problem-solving skills, look no further than Brilliant. Brilliant offers detailed courses that help you learn new concepts in science and math, but on a deeper level, as you complete really interesting and addictive questions and puzzles. You're not just memorizing formulas, you actually learn how to reason through complicated topics. In fact, they have a whole learning path called Science Foundations that'll introduce you how to think scientifically. It'll guide you through all the important stuff in physics, chemistry, and engineering. It's a lot of fun, and who knows, it may even help you read some of these papers about these Schedule I drugs coming out. To get started on your own scientific journey and to learn more about Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/neurotransmissions and sign up for free. And also, the first 200 people that go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. Awesome. As we've seen, some states have taken matters into their own hands by decriminalizing or even legalizing some of these Schedule I drugs. And I've read a lot of discussions about reclassifying certain drugs one by one. But that doesn't address the systemic issue with our current drug scheduling system. Instead, I think that there's a simple change that would immensely improve the situation. Simply remove the criteria about whether drugs have a medical use. Imagine if drugs were only scheduled regarding their potential for abuse or addiction. We'd have a much more logical structure. Only the riskiest drugs would top the list, which means that research and medical use opportunities would open up for lower tiered drugs. I mean, right now, it's easier to do research on more addictive drugs like opiates, fentanyl, cocaine, meth, simply because they're already known to be medically useful. How does that make sense? So, if you like how this sounds, then let's get a movement going. I actually couldn't find another bandwagon to jump onto, so I decided to build one myself. It seems like no one is talking about this aspect of the law. So what I did was I created a change.org petition to ask Congress and the president to change how the DEA schedules drugs by removing the medical use criteria. If you like how that sounds, and if you'd like to raise awareness on this topic, then please sign the petition and also share with people that you know on social media. I mean, who knows? This could be the start of something really big. Yes, we'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you sticking with me and hearing my thoughts. If you have your own thoughts regarding scheduled substances, then please feel free to leave them down in the comments. And until next time, I'm Micah. Think about it.